The Garrulous Saint by J. H. Archer. Silas Ignatius had the boy's father flogged. The gathered staff remained unmoved as the sound of whip on flesh echoed down the hallways of the great kitchen. Ignatius stood at the pass, inspecting their faces as he might inspect any of his dishes, looking for the most minute of imperfections so that he might reject them. He hadn't come as far as he had by being gentle. His standards were absolute. After the 15th lashing, the man stopped crying out. He stopped making sounds altogether. Ignatius stepped forward and moved from person to person.
I don't take pleasure in this,
he lied.
But it is the price of perfection. If you work in my kitchen, if you come to my table, this is what I expect from each of you. Is that understood?
Yes, King Master.
Now, will someone explain to me why the man is being punished?
There was no answer, just clenched jaws as they avoided his eyes.
Have you all turned mute? Someone answer me.
The cook from the meat station stepped forward.
You were handed a dirty plate, sir.
That's correct. In this kitchen, the kitchen of the planetary governor no less, cleanliness sits by the Emperor's right hand. Is this not so?
Yes, sir!
But that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking why it is that he is getting punished. He specifically...
No one answered. Ignatius felt the room turn cold, and it thrilled him. Utter control. They were his, totally. He let the silence simmer until it was perfect, then stopped with snapped heels in front of the child. The boy, a junior potwash, one of the hundreds that the palace employed, was crying. He quivered with each whip crack.
Well,
said Ignatius.
Look at me, boy.
The boy looked up, cold blue eyes full of tears. Ignatius knelt to be on the child's level. He lowered his voice.
Why am I whipping your father?
Because I cleaned that plate, sir. I handed it to you. It was my fault.
Yes, you did. And yes, it was. Your father should have taught you better.
The boy sniffled, nodding at his toes.
Your first task will be to go and scour the store chamber. Floggings cause an awful mess, and perhaps this time you will take better care. Understood?
Yes, sir.
Good boy.
The child left at a run, heading towards the storeroom where his father was being held. Ignatius stalked back to the pass and picked up the small white plate with the offending strand plastered against it. He let the staff hear the beating one last time, then barked.
Get back to work.
Yes, sir!
And the kitchen sprang back to life, the sounds of their endless toil just about covering those of the distant beating. Meat sizzled in scalding pans, water boiled, pots bashed together in an urgent cacophony. Ignatius leant against the pass, his heart beating so hard he imagined it was a war drum. He called for the junior kitchen master, who snapped to attention at his side.
Have the guards remove the boy and his father from the palace grounds as soon as the storeroom is clean,
Ignatius told him.
No pay, you hear me? Just get them gone.
The man left with a curt nod. Ignatius put the incident out of his mind and returned to his unending work, sharpening his knife until it glinted with a cruel edge. Years later, when Ignatius fired up the ovens one morning, he found Maxim, the governor's son, splayed out on the kitchen table, snoring loudly. The young man was still wearing the dress blues of his planetary guard regiment, stained with mud and other filth Ignatius preferred not to consider. A half-drunk bottle of Amsac clutched in his hand. True, the lad had cause to celebrate. The city had just declared victory against yet another uprising in the lower hives, a victory in which Maxim's unit had played a part, albeit in a provisional role that hadn't required him to go anywhere near the sharp end of combat. The boy had been out with his comrades and had promised his father that the celebrations would be moderate. But with Maxim, they never were.
Master Maxim, wake up,
said Ignatius, But the young man didn't stir.
Master Maxim!
Still nothing. Ignatius sighed deeply, swallowing his disgust, before upending a pot of cold water on the boy's head. After his rude awakening, Maxim sat by the fire in the kitchen, a freshly brewed cup of caffeine clasped in his hands, hair just now drying.
Bad form, Ignatius.
He grumbled.
You're lucky I don't have you drawn and quartered for a stunt like that, pouring water over the son of the planetary governor. I was having such a pleasant dream.
Ignatius dropped a plate of fried groks and starch cakes in front of Maxim, after which he refilled the boy's cup.
Apologies, Master Maxim. But better me than your father.
True. Damn true, Ignatius. I doubt I'd be alive if he'd found me sleeping like that. Keeps reminding me how indolent I am. It's getting rather tiresome.
The boy didn't even wait to be given cutlery, grunting with pleasure as he stuffed food into his mouth.
Delicious. Delicious, Ignatius. How do you get the groks to come out like this?
That's my secret,
said Ignatius with professional satisfaction. Staff were starting to trickle in for the morning service, and he was anxious to get Maxim moving so he could start on the governor's breakfast. There was a high moot due to be called today. At least 100 top-level bureaucrats and their attendants all flocking to the palace. It was hungry work, running a world, so there was much to be done.
Oh, Ignatius, last night,
continued Maxim.
It was fantastic. I wish you could have been there.
I'm not sure I'd be up for what passes for fun amongst you young folk, Maxim.
No, you don't understand. After we'd left the tannery, you know the place, the drinking hole just past the shrine to St. Ezra, well, I can't remember exactly how it happened, but we ended up at this eatery. And by the throne, Ignatius, I could swear it was a dream. The food was fantastic, better than yours even.
Ignatius swallowed his pride then. If it was anyone else, he'd have had them filleted. No one ran a better kitchen than he did. No one in the system. He'd bet his heart on it.
To suggest that must be the AMSAC talking, Master Maxim,
he said.
No, Ignatius, I'm serious. It was divine. I'll have to take you some time, if I can remember where the damn thing is, my treat. You spend too much time down here anyway. You're starting to look like one of those dried fruits you're so fond of serving.
You are most generous, Master Maxim. Now, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I'll get out of your way.
And the boy, stinking like a brewery, stood up with a groan and passed the old kitchen master with a tap on his shoulder. He was almost out of the room before he turned back with a start.
Oh, Ignatius, I almost forgot.
He called.
I got talking to the kitchen master of that place. About you, actually. He was very interested. In fact, he sent a sample of his work back for you to try. It's on the side, over there.
What do you mean?
I mean, if he's good, I'll get my father to bring him up to work in the palace. You always say you could use some more help. Let me know what you think. Anyway, thanks for the breakfast.
Then he left. The box was small and white, and tied with a bow of deep purple silk. Ignatius was considering throwing it away out of hand. The kitchen was his kingdom, and he didn't need any fool meddling with the running of it, when it hit him first. The smell. That glorious smell. Not quite savory, not quite sweet, almost floral. It seemed to change with each breath, drawing him closer with a delicate seductiveness. He opened the box with trepidation and found a white dish, on which there lay a card that read, "To Silas Ignatius, Kitchen Master, for your consideration." And there, beneath the card, was a perfectly presented cut of meat. No sauces, no reductions. Just the cut itself, sliced into 6 equally sized segments. He salivated, and his pulse jumped. He put the first piece into his mouth, and he knew immediately that he had never made something so perfect in his life. It was so simple, yet so inevitable. There was something about this cut. By the throne. What was it? A flavor, a note that he couldn't place. And what meat? So tender. He immediately devoured the second segment, and then the third. He kept on eating until there was nothing left to do but scrape the juices from the box. He felt a flush of thrill, then shame. He, Silas Ignatius, the greatest kitchen master in the sector. Could there be someone better than he was? The weeks passed, and no matter how hard he tried, no matter the skill and craft he applied, he couldn't recreate the dish. He made rump of grox served with Ithacan salt, an amble loin with a citrus glaze, and fillet of saberfish with caramelized Vitrian sugar glass. He had the quartermaster commission the slaughtering of the last great marshland zoaks, the only breeding pair in existence. But the meat turned out to be gristly and bitter. He emptied the nearby markets of their provision and provender, only for the majority of it to end up rotting on the street outside the palace, unused. The days became long and passed agonizingly. He became thinner than usual, so thin he barely cast a shadow. Maxim passed him after breakfast one day and said,
Ignatius, whatever is the matter? You look like you're eating yourself alive.
No matter, Master Maxim.
He replied.
Just old age, I'm afraid. Don't grow old is my advice.
Perhaps it's time for you to retire, old man,
said Maxim with a laugh, as he ambled on past. Ignatius let out a weak laugh in reply and found himself alone in the kitchen. He rubbed his temples, nursing the same headache he'd had for days. And, what was worse, Ignatius was appalled to find himself slowly forgetting the taste of that perfect dish. If only he had kept some back instead of eating it all. He cursed himself for his gluttony. But he never forgot the desire for more. More. He needed more. Ignatius delivered the governor's morning caffeine. He stalked down the long hallway towards the great stateroom doors, holding the tray aloft with his right hand. He felt it shake with effort. By the throne. When had he become so weak? He was just about to knock when he heard the voices coming from within.
He's getting old, Father.
And?
Well, don't you think it's time we replaced him?
Maxim, since when were you so concerned with the staffing at the palace?
Just a thought. Besides, I think I have the perfect alternative.
Ignatius felt all the blood rush from his head, and for a moment, he thought he was going to pass out. In fact, he almost did, and the tray slipped from his hand onto the floor with a mighty crash. Ignatius scrambled to his feet as fast as he could, but the damage was done. Maxim stood at the door, looking down at the old kitchen master, and the worst of it was that the boy didn't say anything. He just knelt and helped Ignatius to pick up the pieces of the broken cups. Later that same day, he managed to catch Maxim just before the boy left for his weekly sortie along the hive's outer walls.
Master Maxim.
The governor's son looked at him in surprise.
Ignatius? By the throne, is that you? Since when do you travel this far from the kitchens?
I came looking for you.
Me? Whatever for?
Ignatius shuffled his feet nervously.
The other night, when you came in after you'd been drinking and...
You're not still angry about that, are you?
Maxim began.
Angry? No, Master Maxim, no. It's just... Can you remember the eatery you went to?
Of course. I've been back a few times.
Would you take me?
Maxim suddenly became serious. He lowered his voice.
Ignatius, you must understand, it's a very select establishment. Are you sure?
I'm sure.
Tell you what, I'm going there again tonight. I'll make inquiries.
Thank you, Master Maxim. Thank you.
2 days later, a letter came. It arrived much as the box had. Perfect white paper, wrapped in a purple ribbon, stamped with a simple red seal. Perfumed, delicious, enticing. Ignatius ripped it open and read it by candlelight in the kitchen. To Silas Ignatius, kitchen master. You are hereby cordially invited to dine at the Garrulous Saint, Eatery Supreme, where all who seek may find. 2 nights from now, the lower hive. Come alone, or do not come at all. Ignatius stood in front of the governor's desk, snapped to attention. The man barely looked up from the dossier he was reading. Ignatius had to cough politely to announce his presence.
Well, Ignatius, what is it?
Sir, I've served you faithfully for many years,
Yes, man. Yes, you have.
and I've never asked for much.
The governor set his dossier down.
Look, get to the point, will you?
I'd like to take some time if you'd permit it, sir.
Ignatius said.
Just a trip into the hive. My sister, you see, she's not very well. And
Yes, save me the preamble. Fine. Maxim said you were looking a bit ropey. I'll give you a day, but when you're back, I expect a return to form, you understand?
2 days later, Ignatius was lost. He stood on the corner of some throne-forsaken street in the hive sublevels, desperately looking for any clue as to the location of the eatery. Hours of searching had proved fruitless. Many of the people he'd asked didn't even know the word eatery, let alone the location of the Garrulous saint. He reread the invitation for the 100th time. Lower hive, it said, but that was all. The crowds were everywhere there, blocking the streets like clots. He pulled up the ragged hood of the cloak he'd borrowed from one of the junior cooks, so as to blend in with the masses. But he knew it didn't offer much anonymity. It wouldn't be long until he was noticed. He had to get going. Ignatius shouldered his way into the crowd and let the flow of people take him deeper into the sublevels. It began to get darker as he descended, and his surroundings became less and less familiar with each step. The pale steel of the upper levels turned to a dark rust, and before long, Ignatius found himself stumbling through streets lit only by weak gaslights. He wasn't sure he'd even be able to find his way out at this point. Perhaps he might stop an enforcer and ask to be escorted back to the palace. But then he realized he hadn't seen one in hours. And, in truth, deep down, he didn't want to go back. No, the taste of that dish gnawed at his belly. He needed it. He wanted more. Ignatius was working his way down a street full of vendors selling scrap metal when he first noticed them. A group of men, dirty and ragged, pushing through the crowd behind, looking directly at him with a feral urgency. Ignatius quickened his pace, hoping to lose them in the dark side streets. But every time he thought he'd slipped their net, they soon reappeared. Ignatius began to panic and broke into a run, but his efforts were futile. He rounded a corner and found himself in a blind alley. He realized his mistake immediately, but knew it was already too late to rectify, and the men quickly cut off his escape. One of them stepped forward, flicking a small knife from hand to hand. Ignatius's first thought was that the blade didn't look sharp enough to pass inspection in his kitchen. He could taste panic on his tongue then. True fear. How long had it been since he'd experienced that taste? It was almost novel to him again. Metal and blood.
Ignatius, is it?
Said the man with the knife. They tied a rough Hessian sack over Ignatius's head and dragged him by the collar through the streets like livestock. He didn't know how long he stumbled along for, and he expected to feel the keen cut of the blade at any moment, but no cut came. Ignatius was close to exhaustion when they finally stopped, and the sack was taken from his head. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the light, but he found himself looking at a shop front, over which hung a sign that read, "The Garrulous Saint, Eatery Supreme." The windows of the shop were boarded up with cheap reclaimed wood. The paintwork was old and faded. The door itself, once a bright polished brass, now hung limply from a single hinge. For a moment, Ignatius worried this was all just an elaborate prank by Maxim, perhaps punishing him for the rude awakening. But then, the sound of a hot pan, sizzling with oil, and the whistling of a kitchen master at work emanated from within.
Come in, Ignatius.
Came the call.
Come in. Dinner will soon be ready.
Ignatius stepped through the empty doorway and into the darkness of the eatery. It was clear to him that this had once been a place of immense splendor. His eye fell upon deep purple upholstery and rouge curtains, rich mahogany furniture set with the finest silver cutlery. The opulence lay draped across the place like a ghost, refusing to move on. Now, the eatery was stained, covered in the filth of the passing of years unloved, spray-painted by hive hooligans, and plastered in the remains of the innumerable rough sleepers that had used the place as a one-time refuge.
Hello?
Called Ignatius.
Maxim, is that you? If this is your idea of a trick, then...
Through here.
Came the cheery call from a room in the back.
Just through here. Come, come.
Ignatius walked through the main dining room and into the kitchen beyond. There he found a man, young, light-haired and slight, standing at the oven top, frying what seemed to be a single cut of meat. For a moment, the man didn't notice Ignatius, or at least didn't respond to his presence. He flipped the cut once, twice, before serving it onto a plate, whistling as he did so. He seasoned it, then picked up the dish and brought it to a small table that had been set up in the middle of the room. He placed the dish and sat down, finally looking directly at Ignatius. He smiled, the kind of smile that made you immediately want to be friends, easy, assured, charming.
Sit and eat,
the man said.
I've been waiting for you, Ignatius. I've prepared something for you.
Ignatius crept forwards, tentative, before sitting down at the table opposite the man. His host slid the plate slightly closer to Ignatius and handed him a knife and fork.
Is this what you sent me before? Through Maxim?
Asked Ignatius.
No questions? Try it.
Ignatius cut a slice of the meat and placed it in his mouth. It was delicious, cooked just as he liked it. But it wasn't the same dish.
What do you think?
Asked the man.
It's magnificent, but it's not what you sent me.
No, it's not.
I need to know how you made it. I couldn't get it out of my head.
You enjoyed it.
Enjoyed it? It was...
The man smiled.
Unlike anything you've ever tasted.
Yes!
Totally unique. Like being able to see a new color.
Yes! Yes!
And you want to know how I made it?
I must know.
Ignatius said.
If you tell me, I'll bring you back to the palace. You can work with me there. A talent like yours mustn't be squandered. I'll take you on as my junior. No, more. You'll be my partner. We'll learn from each other.
The man paused. Some darkness flashed across his face, and he licked his lips before the sanguine expression returned. He got up and walked over to a small cabinet in the back, producing an expensive-looking bottle of Amsac and 2 glasses. He poured them both a glass and offered one to Ignatius.
To clean your palate,
he said.
For the next course.
Ignatius drank it greedily. The man's smile grew.
You don't recognize me?
He asked. Ignatius's head began to spin. His stomach turned. His face went numb.
No, I suppose not. I have changed over the years.
Ignatius found that he couldn't move. Fear spread through him like a fever. The man's face transformed, the very flesh of it seeming to warp and tear and reshape in impossible ways before settling on a familiar form. Ignatius never forgot a face, although it had been years since he'd seen this one. A filthy plate, cold blue eyes, the sound of whip on flesh. Ignatius's head swam, and the corners of his vision began to darken. Fantastic pains ripped through his guts, and it felt as if someone had poured fire down his throat. It felt remarkable, a kind of pleasure that he'd never thought possible.
You see it now, don't you?
Said the man.
That night, after you had my father beaten. You know, A person can get so hungry that anything will taste like the greatest meal you could imagine. When you had us thrown out, we came to the underhive and lived off scraps, off corpse starch so rotten it was more maggot than anything else. No one would take us in. Mercy is not a familiar dish. And then my father's wounds got worse, and he weakened, and he died.
Ignatius tried to say something then, but his tongue was a dead weight in his mouth.
I knew then I was going to starve to death, Ignatius. I wasn't old enough to fend for myself alone in the hive. So, I did what I had to do. My father still had some meat on his bones. I couldn't let it go to waste. And the taste, Ignatius, the taste, it was marvelous. I had to have it again. I had to know what that flavor was. I spent years trying to track it down, trying to recreate it. I studied in every kitchen I could worm my way into, until eventually the answer came to me. The truth that these people try to hide from you. But I found someone willing to tell me the truth, to tell me everything. They showed me flavors, pleasures, beyond your imagining.
Something dark glowed in his eyes as Ignatius watched transfixed. Something shadowy and vile.
And I'll show you what I found, Ignatius.
Ignatius tried to rise, but he felt his legs give way. Someone caught him from behind and began dragging him towards the main table.
Oh, I'll show you.
Then, darkness was all. When Ignatius came to, he found himself strapped down to a long, pristine mahogany table. He was in the middle of the eatery, but it was not as he remembered it. This was the eatery at the height of its former glory. All around there were people, laughing, drinking, and indulging. The waiters were shackled at the feet, and their faces were twisted and warped into grotesque, ossified smiles. The man stood at the foot of the table, and on seeing Ignatius wake, he reached into his robe and pulled out a long, wicked knife. He knocked it against the side of his glass, and the crowd quietened.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for gathering here tonight to share with me what is a great, immense pleasure. In fact, tonight our celebrations are twofold. First, we welcome a new member into our esteemed company. Maxim, please, stand.
The governor's son stood, bowing graciously to the gathered company.
Without Maxim's help, I would never have been able to finally create my masterpiece, my magnum opus. I present to you my latest dish. I call it revenge.
There was rapturous applause, and the man bowed deeply, tears in his eyes.
The key to this dish I discovered many years ago when I was but a boy, and the key ingredient is this: suffering. Suffering in the moments before death. It makes the meat more tender than you could imagine. It is a flavor unlike any other.
Ignatius closed his eyes just before the knife reached him. The pain was agonizing, as if he had been enveloped by fire. He could hear the gush of blood matching the tempo of his now failing heartbeat. The man lifted the blade and cut again, once, twice, 3 times. But instead of more pain, with each blow the sensation changed. It moved from agony to warmth, from panic to peace, until Ignatius willed it on, as he was caught in the throes of ecstasy. The man leant down low and whispered into Ignatius's ear.
Open your mouth, Ignatius, and try the dish I have prepared for you.
There, on the end of the knife, was a perfect cut of raw meat, still warm and slick with blood. The people in the eatery began to sharpen their cutlery. Ignatius took a bite of what was offered to him. It was perfection. Yes, that flavor. He'd forgotten. That was what he'd been looking for. That was what he had been missing all along.